Following the German invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939, the United Kingdom and her allies declared war on Germany several days later. The Kriegsmarine had surface vessels in position to attack Allied shipping, including two Panzerschiffe, the Deutschland and Admiral Graf Spee. Although not what Rear Admiral Karl Dönitz, the commander of Germany's submarine force, wanted in terms of numbers, the Kriegsmarine had its U-boats out in force, waiting for the order to attack Allied shipping. One of these happened to be U-29, commanded by Kapitänleutnant Otto Schuhart, who had been on patrol in the Atlantic for several weeks and was returning to Germany through the English Channel. The British and the Royal Navy, for their part, with the U-boat campaigns of the First World War a recent memory, they had several strategies to deal with these underwater threats. The first being the tried-and-true convoy system, in which merchant ships gathered together and traveled as a group under escort from ships equipped to deal with the threat. One of those tools developed to help counter this threat was ASDIC, otherwise known as sonar. Although having a limited range, it was adequate for ships escorting convoys, as they were able to position themselves around the merchant ships and hopefully be able to locate the approaching U-boat and use another tool developed to counter the U-boats, the depth charge, and be able to sink it before it did any damage. Another strategy the Royal Navy implemented was the use of aircraft to spot U-boats moving into and out of the Atlantic. Although newer U-boats were able to have the fuel capacity to reach the Atlantic by going around the north of Scotland. The last strategy, implemented at the behest of the First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, was the Hunter-Killer Group, where it was to consist of an aircraft carrier and her escorting destroyers. The carrier would send up aircraft to patrol, and if they spot a U-boat, they were to radio its location, and a portion of these escorting destroyers were to assist the aircraft in destroying the U-boat. In the early part of the war, there were other groups designated as hunter-killer groups that consisted of cruisers that were supposed to deal with surface threats. However, on September 17th, the former group consisting of the carrier Courageous and her escorting destroyers were off the southwest coast of Ireland, in the western approaches, conducting one of these offensive air operations against U-boats, when suddenly she was struck by torpedoes from U-29, taking over 500 men down with her, being the first capital ship lost of the war. Before we continue, this is a remake of an older video that I was not happy with and wanted to give a more detailed account. There's also an older video where I detail her career, link in the description. Anyway, following the commissioning of Ark Royal, Courageous was used as a training carrier from December 1938 until August of 1939 when she joined the Channel Force, a temporary force stationed out of Plymouth and Portland, being created as one of those hunter-killer groups. It is important to understand the reasoning behind the creation of these hunter-killer groups, and in Ark Royal, Sailing into Glory by Mark Rossiter, he describes the situation in early September 1939. Churchill knew it was vital to blunt the U-boat menace. German troops were continuing their blitzkrieg in Poland, but the only direct conflict between British and German forces was at sea. If the U-boat campaign against British shipping were successful, it would cause serious damage to British morale and encourage those voices in the cabinet who believed that the war was an avoidable mistake. There was a severe shortage of escort ships and anti-submarine warships, so Churchill moved 12 destroyers from the Mediterranean fleet to help strengthen the anti-submarine patrols. In addition, 3 aircraft carriers, Courageous, Hermes, and Ark Royal, were mobilized as the nucleus of these hunter-killer groups to actively search for and sink the hostile U-boats. The Ark Royal, with a group of destroyers, patrolled the northwestern approaches, where the Athenia had been hit, and the other 2 groups were stationed to the south of Ireland, the western approaches. Churchill likened these hunter-killer groups to a cavalry division. It was an extremely risky strategy and a task for which the carriers had never been intended. In theory, aircraft from the carriers could search large areas of the ocean, forcing the submarines to remain submerged. But in practice, the carriers themselves were targets. These large, expensive ships had been placed in grave danger. Before Courageous even left Plymouth for her last operation in the western approaches, another group with Ark Royal at its center sailed for offensive air operations against U-boats near Scotland. She nearly met the same fate as Courageous, as U-39 was stalking the aircraft carrier and fired 2 torpedoes at Ark Royal, both of which missed, and in the ensuing depth charge attack from Ark Royal's destroyers, they were successful in sinking the U-boat. This was the first U-boat sunk in the Second World War. Not only that, While Ark Royal was under attack, her skuas were off attacking another U-boat, the U-30, the one that had sunk the Athenia. Churchill was so emboldened by the success of Ark Royal that he visited the ship when she returned from patrol to Lock U, where he inspected the ship and men and congratulated them on a job well done. Churchill returned to London the following day by train, where he was met by the First Sea Lord of the Admiralty, Sir Dudley Pound, who wanted to be the first person to inform the First Lord of the tragedy that had transpired on the 17th of September, when Courageous was sunk in the western approaches. Courageous left Plymouth on the 16th of September to head towards the western approaches off the southwestern coast of Ireland to carry out her offensive air operations against U-boats. In the First World War, this was a hot spot for U-boat activity, and in this war, it appeared that it was going to be the same way. This area was vital to the United Kingdom, as it is where a majority of Britain's shipping ports are located. For a nation that was reliant on imports before the war, these were necessary to keep open for shipping. Courageous was captained by one William Totfield Making Jones, and it was not his first time entering possibly U-boat-infested waters, as he had served in the First World War with the Grand Fleet. It was not his first deployment with Courageous in the role of hunter-killers, as he and the ship had participated in multiple patrols in the preceding days with their aircraft attacking supposed U-boat threats. This time, on the 16th, she was joined by 4 destroyers, these being Ingolfeld, Ivanhoe, Impulsive, and Intrepid, which was a more extensive escort than she had previously. The next afternoon, on the 17th, Courageous was steaming westward at high speed to catch up with the aircraft that had taken off at 4:15 p.m. to attack a U-boat, U-53, that was shelling the merchant vessel SS Kafiristan. When the strike group of aircraft left, 2 of the escorting destroyers, Ingolfeld and Intrepid, raced ahead to assist in the hunt for the offending submarine, leaving Courageous with only the Ivanhoe on her port side and Impulsive on her starboard bow. At around 7:20 that night, Courageous turned on a southeasterly course into the wind and reduced her speed to help the striking force land. 35 minutes later, at 7:55, 2 large explosions in rapid succession could be heard and felt throughout the ship. All the lights in the ship went dark, and she began to list heavily to port. The attacker was a German U-boat, U-29, commanded by Kapitänleutnant Otto Schuhart. Rear Admiral Karl Dönitz had ordered out his U-boats in advance to make sure that they were in position to patrol the Atlantic and the western approaches to the United Kingdom. Initially, the U-boats were to abide strictly by the Hague Convention and the 1936 London Naval Treaty concerning submarine warfare, at least for now. This was broken when the SS Athenia was sunk on the first day of hostilities between Britain and Germany. In World War II at sea, Craig L. Simmons describes the nature of the U-boat command in this part of the war. For his part, Dönitz was only moderately disappointed that the Führer placed limits on his submarines since, with the small number of boats he had available, all he could do was deliver what he called a few odd pinpricks. Soon enough, it became evident that the British were not going to reconsider their declaration of war after all, and Hitler lifted the restrictions, informing Dönitz that his U-boats could now attack without warning any vessel identified as hostile. Before sighting Courageous, a valid target, U-29 had been at sea for several weeks, and was returning to Germany after a successful campaign, sinking 3 merchant ships. U-29 was returning to Germany through the English Channel. At around 6 p.m., Schuhart spotted the carrier group by chance and began pursuing it. Schuhart almost gave up on the chase because he was not gaining on the ship and was not in a favorable enough position to attack the carrier until she turned onto the southeasterly course to recover her swordfish that had flown off to attack U-53. U-29 fired a spread of 3 torpedoes, with 2 of them striking Courageous. One of the torpedoes striking just abreast of the petty officer's flat, and the other on the after end of B boiler room. Following this, HMS Ivanhoe turned to attack and dropped depth charges. Meanwhile, HMS Impulsive headed to the starboard bow and dropped anchor astern to pick up men abandoning the ship. However, U-29 made its escape and evaded the attacking destroyers, even though she was being vigorously hunted until past midnight, and returned to Germany. After that, her captain received the Iron Cross First Class, and the crew received the Iron Cross Second Class. Courageous went down alarmingly fast, within 15 minutes of being hit. taking over 500 men down with her, as well as the ferry Swordfish aircraft of the 811th and 822nd Air Squadrons, and among the dead was her captain, Making Jones. On board Courageous, following the two explosions, the lights went out and the ship immediately took on a heavy list. The power went out almost immediately. The Typhon siren started and could not be stopped. The quartermaster reported that the ship had lost all steering. Captain Making Jones ordered that the ship's position be sent out, while the signal books were being collected for destruction. At 8:05 p.m., loud crashing noises were heard, these most likely being bulkheads collapsing, and the ship took on an even more prominent list of about 35 degrees. Captain Making Jones ordered that the international code signal, "Stand by me," be hoisted, and said that anyone that wished to leave the ship was at liberty to do so. One of these men who chose to abandon ship was Sub-Lieutenant I.F. West Maycott, and taking from HMS Courageous 1939, Eyewitnesses of World War II, this account was originally printed in the Daily Telegraph about a week after the sinking of Courageous. Paymaster Sub-Lieutenant I.F. West Maycott, the captain's secretary, was having his supper in the Courageous when he heard two explosions, which seemed to lift the ship. All lights went out and crockery fell over. He continued, "I got out of the wardroom and made my way to the seaplane platform on top of the quarterdeck. People waiting there did not seem to realize that the ship would sink soon. Suddenly, an order was given for everyone to get into the water. Some men went to the floats, and others got boats out. I stripped and jumped into the water. I was in about 40 minutes, swimming all the time, until I reached one of the destroyers. Everybody behaved with calm, and the men cracked jokes. There was no panic or disorder. Almost immediately after the attack, the Courageous began to list a port, and within 5 minutes, the captain gave the orders to abandon her. Her bow submerged, her stern cocked up into the air, and she foundered within 15 to 20 minutes of being hit. On the upper decks, all boats except sea boats were turned in and secured. Due to the severe list, no boats on the starboard side except the cutter could be lowered, which had sustained damage and became waterlogged shortly after being lowered into the water. Other boats on the port side were lowered by some ratings, along with Carley floats. Things like gratings and loose woodwork were tossed into the water to assist the men in treading water. Between decks, all important watertight doors had been closed, but due to the heavy list and without power, it was impossible to close the remaining doors. Shortly after the explosions, the captain had ordered the starboard bulges be flooded, but the order did not get through. Still, Lieutenant E. Sedgwick, along with 2 other men, proceeded to the Z Seacock and attempted to flood the starboard bulge. However, due to the explosion, they were unable to do so. In the hangars, the few officers and men that were there when the torpedo struck were able to escape, although personnel in the lower hangar had difficulty in forcing a way through the fire curtains as they had been jammed. Lieutenant E. Shenton was on watch in the forward center engine room, where after the explosion and the loss of power, he ordered the starboard engines to be stopped and ordered the engine room's evacuation. As steam was falling rapidly with a considerable steam leak, Shenton operated the emergency bulkhead valve, closed the lever, and rang the sprayer telegraphs to 0. As for the other engine room, a stoker came up from the boiler room with his overalls on fire and could give no information. Other men who came up could give no information either. As Impulsive was rescuing survivors, she was soon joined by the American merchant ship Collingsworth, the British merchant ship Dido, and the Dutch passenger ship Vedum, which launched 14 lifeboats. But the rescue work would prove difficult as the sea was covered in oil. Further help arrived as other Royal Navy ships came. One of the more dramatic accounts of the sinking comes from a naval writer, Tom Hughes, who was 18 years old at the time of the sinking. When the first torpedo explosion occurred, he said he was in the canteen. He made a rush for the upper deck, and as he was going to the companionway, there was another explosion and a sheet of flame. He found men were throwing overboard pieces of wood, oars, and anything that would float. As an officer gave the order, "Swim for it," he clambered down a rope and dropped into the sea, which was so thick with oil we might as well have been swimming in treacle. He reached for a raft and was eventually taken on board a destroyer. Hundreds of us who were struggling in the water for our lives raised a cheer. While we were swimming, someone shouted, "Are we downhearted?" and there was a resounding no in reply. Hughes said that one of his most vivid recollections, that as he was in the water, he caught a glimpse of the commander of the Courageous, Captain Making Jones, standing at the salute on the bridge as the vessel took her final plunge. As for myself, those 3 hours in the water seemed much longer. I must pay tribute to the handling of the destroyer that saved us. She was so well navigated that the swell created by her progress helped us to swim towards her. As I got fairly near her, a fellow seaman swam alongside and said, "Help me." I gripped him by the hair, and when a man off the destroyer caught me to pull me aboard, I was still hanging on. That chap's long absence from the barbers saved his life. Another impression which will live in my memory is that of a Royal Marine sergeant who seemed to cover an enormous distance, swimming from man to man and making remarks such as, "Keep going, my lad, and you will be all right. Keep your heart up and keep your head up." There were heroes in plenty, but that sergeant was the greatest I saw. Turning to the Allies' side, the British had dispatched Glorious as well as the carrier Ark Royal on May 31st as part of a force that was to assist in the evacuation of Norway in and around Narvik. In all, Operation Alphabet could be considered a success with the evacuation of 25,000 Allied troops. Although it is often overlooked as Operation Dynamo, the evacuation of France from Dunkirk was going on at the same time. Ark Royal and Glorious played two very different roles in this operation. Ark Royal was to carry out bombing missions ashore and to provide fighter cover for the troop ships, while Glorious only carried enough aircraft for her protection. She was there to re-embark RAF aircraft and return them home to the United Kingdom as a shuttle of sorts. The two carriers were off the Norwegian coast by the 2nd of June and started their various missions. It was hoped that Glorious would be able to fly on the RAF Gladiators based out of Bardufoss Air Base. The Gladiators were able to land. Not only that, there were still Hurricanes in Norway. These too were flown onto Glorious, with only a minimal amount of damage being an impressive feat, as both these types of RAF fighters were not designed to land on carriers. This was completed by the 7th. The next morning, Glorious was zigzagging at 17 knots, with a portion of her boilers not connected, on her way back to the United Kingdom. The two ships accompanying her, Acosta and Ardent, were on either side of her bow as an anti-submarine screen. And soon after, Gneisenau entered the fray and fired on Glorious. A sailor on Glorious said about the first salvos, "Almost." Meanwhile, Ardent, the northernmost destroyer, commanded by Lieutenant Commander J.F. Barker, after going to challenge the oncoming German ships, and upon being fired at, she began laying a protective smoke screen. She charged the German battleships at full speed, firing her forward two 4.7-inch guns. The ship that the Acosta had hit was the Scharnhorst. According to her war diary, this hit occurred at 6:39 p.m., causing damage and flooding to the ship, which put sea turret out of action and a temporary drop in speed. After firing her torpedoes, Acosta slipped back into her smokescreen, and as soon as she poked out of her smokescreen again, the German ships were ready. She was hit hard, with a shell hitting the engine room and killing the crew of Carter's tube. Even though she was hit, Acosta's guns kept firing on defiantly. Soon, that ceased, as she was hit several more times. A large explosion seemed to lift the ship out of the water, and that was her end. The last time the captain, Charles Glassford, was seen, he had taken a cigarette from the case and lit it, telling the men of Carter's raft, "Goodbye and good luck." By that time in the battle, Glorious had gone down a little while earlier. On the German side, an account of the bravery of the little destroyers was recorded from memory on the 19th of July, 1945, by Vice Admiral Schubert, being the executive officer on Scharnhorst during the battle. He finishes off his account by saying, "Not only the tactical handling, but the audacity and pluck of the destroyers were outstanding. Every officer taking part in the action agreed. The destroyers put their utmost into the task. Although in their hopeless position, success was impossible from the start." The loss of life was large, with 1,519 Royal Navy and Royal Air Force personnel perishing. For the survivors, the ordeal would continue for some time. As the abandoned ship order came, men jumped into the oil and debris-strewn water, and Hellas recalled, "Some were almost non-swimmers, and the shock of the deep dive had been fatal. They knew they were jumping to their certain death, poor devils, but they jumped unflinchingly because they got the order to abandon ship. Now the ship had abandoned them, and they were dead, gripped in their lifebelts, bobbing like a mute chorus of flotsam. Men drifted about, trying to find something to cling on to, finding Carly floats to grab onto or climb into. To keep their spirits up, they sang songs or hymns. In the cold Norwegian water, staying alive, even in the rafts and boats, was difficult. Many of the 900 men who abandoned the ship succumbed to the icy water. Stoker James O'Neill recalls, "It wasn't long before the first man died. I felt a terrible feeling come over me to watch a man die like that at first. The second man was my mate, Stoker Bartlett, one of the finest lads I knew. It was a sad end to such a man as him. The Padre said a few prayers and told the man nearest to put him over the side. After these two, it was one man after the other going to their maker. A few looked at me when they were on their last, with a look in their eyes asking me to help them. But they were past help, and it was that cold. I couldn't move if I could have helped them. It was a terrible thing, the look they gave me at times. It haunts me. I wish I could forget it." HMS Barham was one of 5 Queen Elizabeth-class super dreadnoughts built for the Royal Navy in the 1910s, being the 4th ship laid down. In the Second World War, she served first in the Mediterranean Fleet and was then transferred to the Home Fleet in December of 1939, where she had her first near-fatal encounter with a U-boat, U-30, which managed to hit Barham in the bows, keeping her in the docks until April of 1940. As the war in the Mediterranean expanded, Barham assisted in the decisive Battle of Cape Matapan, helping to sink 3 Italian heavy cruisers. However, what she is most famous for is when, on the 25th of November 1941, as she was steaming in a single line with Queen Elizabeth and Valiant, supporting operations off the Libyan coast, she was struck by 3 torpedoes fired from U-331. Hitting so close together, a large hole was torn in her port side. Not even 5 minutes later, as the ship rolled over onto her side and her crew desperately tried to escape the doomed ship, a large explosion occurred, ensuring her doom. This explosion, the plight of her crew, and the final loss of the ship was all captured on film, making it a uniquely tragic tale. Out of her large crew, 862 men were killed. Of these were 56 officers and 806 ratings, while around 400 men were saved. In late 1941, the battle raged in North Africa between Allied and Axis forces. The Mediterranean fleet, although battered and bruised from the evacuation of Crete, convoy operations to Malta, and acting in support of Allied land forces on the African continent, the fleet was out supporting land forces late in the month of November, as Italian convoys were heading to North Africa with supplies from Rommel's Afrika Korps and other Axis soldiers. Force K from Malta, consisting of the cruisers Aurora, Penelope, and the destroyers Lance and Lively, and Force B from Alexandria, consisting of the cruisers Ajax, Neptune, the destroyers Kimberley and Kingston, sortied to meet the Italian forces on the 23rd of November. Force K intercepted and sank the Italian convoy on the 24th. However, Vincent P. O'Hara, in his book The Struggle for the Middle Sea, The Great Navies at War in the Mediterranean Theater 1940 to 1945, has this to say: "The risk involved in every sortie was demonstrated 2 days later. Admiral Cunningham, pressed by Churchill, who wired his naval commander on the 23rd, stopping of these ships may save thousands of lives apart from aiding a victory of cardinal importance, had sailed with the Mediterranean fleet to support further sorties of Force K and Force B. The Mediterranean fleet was out in force, including the battleships Queen Elizabeth, Valiant, and Barham, while a threat to the battleships lurked beneath the waves in the form of a German U-boat, U-331, commanded by Hans Dietrich von Tessenhausen. German U-boats in the Mediterranean were proving to be an issue, just like in the Atlantic, with their introduction in September and reinforcements in November 1941, sinking major warships like the carrier HMS Ark Royal, while she helped to deliver Hurricanes to Malta earlier in November. Von Tessenhausen was a seasoned sailor, having been on numerous U-boat patrols in the Atlantic. However, U-331 was his first command, and he had gone on several previous patrols with U-331 with little success. This more successful patrol for U-331 began from the Greek island of Salamis, where the U-boat had some work done and made its way south towards the North African coast, where U-331 was informed of the Mediterranean fleet's sortie from Alexandria and how they were intended to support the disruption of Italian convoys. For several days, the boat maneuvered as destroyers moved overhead until the early afternoon of the 25th of November, when an Italian plane flew overhead. As the U-boat surfaced at 2 p.m., faint smoke could be seen over the horizon, and at 2:41, destroyers and 3 battleships could be made out. As the distance decreased between U-331 and the oncoming battleships, von Tessenhausen ordered his boat to dive and began to maneuver his way through the screen of destroyers, when at 4:20, the now or never moment came for von Tessenhausen as he had to pick a battleship to fire at. The first he could not reach a shooting position for, and so he turned his attention to the second, and fired a spread of torpedoes, of which 3 struck HMS Barham. U-331 was fired at and forced her to crash dive to a depth well beyond what she was intended to go to, and survived the damage. Von Tessenhausen would go on to do more patrols until U-331 was sunk in November 1942, surviving the sinking of his U-boat. Barham, on November 25, 1941, on the other hand, would not. As I mentioned, Queen Elizabeth, Barham, and Valiant were sailing in a line-ahead formation at a speed of 17 knots and zigzagging. The battleships had an escort of destroyers that were supposed to protect against submarine attack. The screen did not detect U-331 when 3 torpedoes struck Barham very close together, so close that some thought it was one large hit. There was no time for maneuvers. With a ship as old as Barham and the limited amount of modernization, it's no surprise that Barham began listing to port very quickly, so much so that she was still moving forward as she continued to turn over. As the ship continued to list over and her crew tried to go over the side, Barham exploded violently, throwing men and metal into the air and having them crash down into the sea. Likely, we will never know the exact details of the explosion. Turning to British battleships 1906 to 1946, Dr. Norman Friedman discusses the official report from the Admiralty. The torpedoes hit between the funnel and the after turrets, causing the ship to list rapidly. 4 minutes after the hits, with the ship on her beam ends, there was a heavy explosion, probably between X and Y magazines. The Board of Inquiry concluded that the torpedoes had blown in the side of the ship, causing such rapid flooding that she quickly listed to 40 degrees, paused slightly, and then rolled over. The board could not be certain of the cause of the explosion, but suggested that it was due to a fire start in the port 4-inch magazine, which spread to the adjacent 15-inch magazine. By the time the ship exploded, she had already capsized. The officer of the watch nearby an HMS Valiant stated that all observers agreed that there had been 3 explosions, 1 and then 2 in quick succession, all midships between funnel and main mast. The general opinion at the time was the big explosion was the 6-inch magazine rather than A or B, as the center of the explosion was abaft the bridge. The officer thought it was forward of X and Y magazines. ADO/PCO of Barham felt 3 torpedo explosions and a 4th abreast the mainmast. Okay, there are several things to unpack in that quote, so let's put our thinking caps on and get to work. First, the general consensus is that 3 torpedoes struck Barham and that these torpedoes are the root cause of further explosions. 2, there was a further explosion separate from the torpedo hits. Third, the Board of Inquiry felt that a fire in the port 4-inch magazine spread to the adjacent 15-inch magazines and was the cause of the devastating explosion seen in the video. Fourth, the general opinion at the time of the explosion by those who witnessed it was that the big explosion was the 6-inch magazine rather than A or B, as the center of the explosion was abaft the bridge. The officer thought it was forward of X and Y magazines, with those on Barham feeling that the 4th more violent explosion abreast the mainmast. Fifth, because of these torpedoes, the ship began to roll violently and capsize. 6, I'm adding this one in for the video's sake, as some feel other causes might be at play, which we will go over. 7th, I'm also adding this one, what was the cause of the explosion? First things first, I think we can all agree that the torpedoes fired from U-331 are the catalyst for the further explosion. Moving on to the reports from those who were on the scene, which thankfully we have access to that report from the officer of the watch on Valiant, D.F. Trench, where at the end of the report, after having gone over all of the events, he ends it by writing, "All observers are agreed that, as the torpedoes hit, there were 3 explosions, a first one followed about 1 or 2 seconds later by 2 in quick succession, and that the explosions all occurred amidships between the funnel and the main mast. It was not certain what caused the final explosion, but the general opinion was that it was the 6-inch magazine. It was certainly not A or B magazine, as the center of the explosion was abaft the bridge, and I am of the opinion that it was not as far as X magazine." Looking at the footage itself, which is filmed aboard HMS Valiant, you can see what the officer of the watch is talking about, as after the main mast and superstructure dip into the water, and only a few seconds after, a large explosion occurs somewhere in the vicinity of that area. Although I will say it is hard to see where exactly the explosion originates from, since the explosion causes that thick dark smoke to emanate from the ship, not to mention the immense amounts of debris that fly up into the air, with large chunks of her hull and deck being thrown up hundreds of feet into the air. Next, taking a report found in British battleships 1919 to 1945 by R.A. Burt, a lieutenant commander aboard HMS Barham writes, "At 4:10 hours, 25th November 1941, I took over the watch's PCO and ADO, having received reports from all the armament closed up. I entered the chart house to see the ciphers and to acquaint myself with the general situation. Soon after I entered the chart house, I heard and felt a violent explosion. I was just outside the chart house on the port side of the bridge when I felt two more explosions, about half a second apart. I was looking up for aircraft, so I did not see where the explosions took place. 6-inch director fouled my view aft. I continued my course to the ADP and reached the after end of the bridge when I felt the fourth explosion and saw a column of water and wreckage thrown up above the mainmast on the port side. When I reached the ADP, I observed the mainmast and that the ship had a list of 7 degrees or 8 degrees to port. Then a submarine broke the surface, bearing red 120 about 150 to 200 yards away, pointing towards our stern. I could not communicate with the 6-inch armament from the ADP, and before I could get through to the 4-inch armament, the submarine had dived. Valiant was also foul of the range. Valiant fired a burst of pom-pom at the swirl where the submarine had dived and made good shooting, but the overs reached Barham's side. I looked after again and saw that the list increased slightly despite the fact that the ship was altering course rapidly to port. I then gave the order on lifebelts, and this was passed by SB telephone to all quarters, although we could not know whether the orders were received. I told the director's crew to come down and sent the ADP's crew down to the starboard side. At that time, the port side of the boat deck aft was underwater, and the ship was slowly turning over. We watched the water swirling over the port side of the ADP and come up to us in about 1 second. I had no control over my movements in the swirling water and expected soon to be clear. Another account comes from Lieutenant Wolfe. At the time of the first explosion, I was just outside my office, which was on the port side of the ADO flat. This is the first deck above the boat deck on the bridge structure. Since I was leaving the office, I was facing aft and saw the flash of the explosion, which appeared to be immediately above the funnel. After a slight pause, 2 further explosions occurred, both slightly further aft. I crossed immediately to the starboard side, where a crowd was already gathering on the upper deck, and gave my pocket knife to an APO who's trying to unlash 2 Carly floats which were secured at the bottom of the ladder up to the pom-pom deck. I went rapidly back to my office for my Burberry, a large overcoat, and then returned to the starboard side with some difficulty as there already was an appreciable list. I descended to the upper deck where the ship's company was already going over the side. I shouted to all near me to follow their example, rather unnecessarily as there was little panic and the men were not wasting any time. The list was steadily increasing, and as everyone about me was over the guardrail, I went over also at a point level with the forward end of the bridge and slid down to the bilge keel. By now, she was going over fast, and I reached the bottom of the ship, now on an almost vertical wall. Here I hesitated, owing to the difficulty of keeping my balance because the final jump appeared hazardous, with the bottom coming up to meet me. It was then a big explosion took place aft. The ship plunged over so rapidly that I was flung backwards into the water with many others. After being sucked down, we eventually surfaced, and I swam over to a Carly float which appeared close at hand. All traces of the ship had vanished. I discarded my Burberry, blew up my lifebelt, and held onto the side of the float with many more until picked up by HMS Hotspur 1 hour later. After those 2 accounts, we can address the second statement, as those 2 first-hand accounts show there was in fact a further explosion. The location of where that explosion began leaves doubt as to satisfying the statements 3, 4, and 5, as those depend on where the explosion took place, something that the first-hand accounts, the secondary sources, and the Admiralty reports disagree on. As the board could not be certain as to the cause of the explosion, but suggested that it was due to a fire started in the port 4-inch magazine, which spread to the adjacent 15-inch magazine. It is almost impossible to tell where the explosion originated from, especially from a layman's perspective. Because of all this ambiguity, it's understandable the position the Board of Inquiry took. Another piece of speculation that I've seen online and in some sources is the possibility of the boilers having a role in this further explosion. Finally getting to statement number 5. We're returning to Captain C.E. Morgan on Valiant. Our battleships were proceeding westward line ahead, with the Valiant immediately astern of the Barham and with the destroyer screen thrown out ahead of the battle fleet. At 4:23, carrying out a normal zigzag, we turned to port together, thus bringing the ships into echelon formation. Suddenly, at 4:25, I heard a loud explosion, followed by 2 further explosions a couple of seconds later. Fountains of water and 2 enormous columns of smoke shot skywards. The smoke formed an enormous mushroom, gradually enveloping the whole of the Barham except the after part, which was subsequently also blotted out as the ship slid into a vast pall of smoke. As the explosions occurred, the officer of the watch gave the command "hard to port" to keep clear of the Barham. 15 seconds later, I saw a submarine break the surface, possibly forced there by the explosion. Passing from left to right, the submarine was making to cross the Valiant's bows between us and the Barham. He was only about 7 degrees off my starboard bow and 150 yards away, though he must have fired his torpedoes from about 700 yards. As the periscope and then the conning tower appeared, I ordered "full speed ahead, hard to starboard," but with the helm already hard to port, I was unable to turn quickly enough to ram him before he crash dived only 40 yards away on our starboard side. The submarine was visible for about 45 seconds, and simultaneously with our ramming efforts, we opened fire with our starboard pom-poms. He was so close, however, that we were unable to depress the guns sufficiently, and the shells passed over the conning tower. I then gave the order amidships again to avoid turning into the Barham, which was still underway with her engines running but listing heavily to port. As we came up on her beam, she heeled further about 20 or 30 degrees, and through the smoke, I could see all of her quarterdeck and forecastle. Men were jumping into the water and running up on the forecastle. The Barham was rolling on a perfectly even keel, with neither bows nor stern sticking into the air. For 1 minute, she seemed to hang in that position. Then, at 4:28, she suddenly rolled over violently, her mainmast striking the surface on the sea sharply a few seconds later. I saw water pouring into her funnels. There followed a big explosion amidships, from which belched black and brown smoke intermingled with flames. Pieces of wreckage flung high into the air were scattered far and wide, the largest piece being about the size of my writing desk. I immediately ordered "take cover" as the wreckage started flying, and that was the last we saw of the Barham, which had run almost a mile since the moment she was hit. The only signs left were a mass of floating wreckage. The 35,000-ton ship disappeared with unbelievable suddenness. It was only 4 minutes 35 seconds exactly from the moment when the torpedo struck until she had completely disappeared. This account and the video itself leads some to speculate that since the explosion occurs as water begins to pour down the funnel into the boilers, it caused the large, devastating explosion. The basic idea is that as the seawater entered the boiler rooms, it could cause enough steam expansion due to the pressure to furnish the explosion, or the possible catalyst for an even larger magazine explosion. Whether this is the case is something we will never know, but a theory that some suggest nonetheless. That still leaves us with number 6 still not checked off, which, like the Board of Inquiry, I will not officially check off. I think the mystery of the explosion only adds to the tragedy of the story, as in the panic of the moment, it is almost impossible to definitively say what is going on, leading to controversies like the one we've discussed today, or with other Royal Navy vessels like HMS Hood, Royal Oak, Vanguard, Invincible, Queen Mary, and Indefatigable, to name a few. For Statement 7 as well, I'll leave this one ambiguous, because like the Board of Inquiry, I just don't know. The story of the battleship Barham is often overlooked by her explosive demise, and I would recommend you watch my video on her that I will place in the description to get a better idea on what she did in her career, as she participated in several famous and important battles. One last thing that I would like to touch on is something that I've seen online, and that is the idea that Barham was an unlucky ship, especially with her history of damage and her previous brush with a U-boat disaster, and other problems that plagued the ship during her career. So much that some say she was an unwelcome assignment and crewmen didn't want to serve on her. I spent quite a bit of time trying to substantiate these claims by going through period sources, but I really struggled to find evidence of it. So take this idea of her as an unlucky ship with a grain of salt. I will say there might be a kernel of truth to this, as sailors throughout time have been a rather superstitious bunch, and the idea of a ship seeming to be unlucky might not seem too far-fetched. Whatever the case, the sinking of HMS Barham was a tragedy with the loss of so many sailors, shown in great detail through the filming of it. Thank you all for watching. Remember to like and subscribe as it'll help the channel to grow. Until next time, my friends, have a great week.